I think I said 2 years ago, a number of us, and I see a lot of familiar faces, came to the Hill to talk about the urgent need in rare diseases. I was corrected by Jen, and she said it was over 3 years ago. We came about the spring of 2010, a number of us, to begin talking about what was a real crisis in research and development, in this whole network that comes together to make medicines happen in all drug development, but especially in the rare diseases. Patient foundations, patient advocates, individual families, venture capitalists, researchers at universities, the NIH, regulators, large companies, big companies, and yes, certainly the FDA in the middle of much of that. And we described it as a crisis, and it really was. You were at a point where there was very little research being funded in early stage startup companies, even in more mature biotech companies. There wasn't a real interest in rare diseases. They were truly the orphans in the drug development world, where there had been so much excitement in the early days of some of the research around the human genome, the discovery of certain genes, the founding of companies like Genzyme and BioMarin and others. But by 2010, it was at a real crisis. And a lot of us came and eventually mobilized the efforts of everybody in this patient organization. We spent a lot of time in the halls of Capitol Hill on the House and the Senate side describing what the issue was. And I'll give you one very personal example, not from my family's journey, but in the summer of 2010, I was asked with a number of other folks from industry and the patient world to testify in the state of pediatric rare disease research before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the HELP Committee. And there were senior FDA officials, we had folks from industry, we had a number of patient organizations and advocates, and there were a couple of children there, maybe teenagers to younger children, and they all kind of looked the same, as people often do with any particular rare disorder. And this particular one was a rare skin disease where I'd never seen it before. And these kids were wrapped in bandages. They looked like third-degree burn victims. In fact, I thought they were actually victims of trauma, not disease, when I first met them, and then met one of the dads of a young kid who was also testifying that day. And he talked about, he said, this is a disease called EB, and there's a couple of different forms of it, and these kids have this rare disease. And it really, in a very graphically striking, but not in a pitiful way, in a very inspiring way, set the tone for that Senate hearing. And like many of you, I've had the chance to spend a decent amount of time over the years advocating for causes and issues. This one was really unique and certainly very personal to many people in that room. And I could tell you the political leanings on that panel ranged from the far left to the far right, but everybody understood the issues that day. And of the 5 or 6 of us who testified, there was tremendous follow-up. And eventually the industry got involved and so much came together. And there were all these little pieces of legislation. And we were hoping that 1 or 2 of them may actually get enacted into law and become part of what was the PDUFA 5 and its counterpart FIDASIA. The original standpoint, quite frankly, from industry was leave it alone, leave it clean. Eventually they said, well, maybe FDA will grant in one more early meeting to smaller companies. Would that be good? And a lot of people stood up and said, no, we're at a crisis. We have to change. We don't understand how to develop these medicines. People don't know how to make investments. If there are a certain set of guidelines, they can judge risk. But we didn't know how to judge risk as an industry. University researchers didn't know how to move medicines into the clinic, into advanced research. It was truly at that crisis stage. And, as legislation often does, things come in, things come out, and then eventually, through lots of phone calls in that last week or two, I was, I'll say dumbfounded, I was pleasantly surprised to learn that most all of what we had advocated for as a community was included in that legislation. And it was this tremendous sense of accomplishment, but also relief that we had done so much. But we all knew that that was just the start. It was a new tool set of pieces of legislation that would enable the FDA to work with industry, to work with researchers, large companies, small companies, academic researchers, to rapidly advance medicines in areas of great unmet medical need, to look at things like the weight of the evidence, to undertake risk-benefit analyses, very specific, to look at things like the Congressman talked about with accelerated approval, to think fundamentally about clinical trial designs, the use of surrogate endpoints, all the different things that we need to move medicines rapidly and to allow people to move capital into the industry to fund so much research. And I'd say if we were in crisis 3 years ago, I think we are now at a crossroads. We have the tool set with the regulators, Commissioner Hamburg, Dr. Woodcock in particular, and other senior leaders at the FDA. I absolutely, genuinely believe get it and want to work with everybody in our community as well as in the oncology and other spaces where there's such unmet medical need. And we have seen some glimmers of hope. We've seen drugs approved that I think prior to not just the legislation, but the intense focus from the Congress and the patient communities never would have happened. So we've made great progress, and we've moved now in a couple of years from crisis to crossroads. But we've got a lot of work ahead of us still. You know, the Congressman was kind enough to highlight one of the issues around accelerated approval and the guidance that's going to be necessary for us to determine how rapidly we can move medicines forward, not just for a handful or even dozens of diseases, but for hundreds and eventually thousands. So it's with that as background and the thought that we've moved from crisis to now crossroads, and much of the work is actually still yet in front of us, as it typically is. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists. And if I can maybe ask Miriam, you to begin and share your thoughts from a policy perspective, working with the Alpha-1 Foundation. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the organizers for including Alpha-1. And I'm pleased to be here representing the Alpha-1 community today. I want to start off with talking about what Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency is. It's a genetic condition that's passed by parents to their children through their genes. Alpha-1 can result in serious liver disease in children and in adults. But more commonly, it manifests between the ages of 30 and 50 as a severe adult onset lung disease, leaving individuals breathless and often disabled. Alpha-1, while rare, has been able to associate itself with the common disease COPD, which is the third leading cause of death. Alpha-1 is the leading identified genetic risk factor for developing COPD, and at some point in the future, we will understand that all COPD is a disease of genetics and environment. Rare, as you know, is defined by statute as 200,000 or less, and Alpha-1 is estimated to affect 1 of every 2,500 individuals. Yet it's underdiagnosed. We only know about 8,000 patients so far. Alpha-1, like all rare diseases, takes an average of 3 doctors and 7 years from the onset of symptoms to be diagnosed. This is because the diagnosis is not sought and it's not a clinical observation. It requires a blood test. If your child is born with Alpha-1 pediatric liver disease, there's no treatment, with the exception of liver transplantation and all of its attenuating complications. For the lung disease associated with Alpha-1, there is a treatment. Developed with the help of the Orphan Drug Act, it's an augmentation of the missing protein derived from pooled plasma administered intravenously once weekly with an annual cost of approximately $100,000 to $150,000. This treatment arrests but does not reverse the emphysema associated with Alpha-1. So there is great hope for next generation therapies, including the possibility of inhaled therapies. Alpha-1, in fact, is fortunate amongst rare diseases to have a treatment and to have a research infrastructure that's extended life. Of the 7,000 estimated rare diseases, only about 300 have licensed treatments. This is a tragic situation that we should address with urgency. Drug development is done in partnership, and for orphan development, the federal government is a critical partner. Any move that Congress makes to stimulate the business environment in the area of orphan drug development offers hope to patients and family members that their loved ones may have a better chance of survival, amelioration of their symptoms, or a better quality of life. It's for this reason that we've come before you today to urge you to respect and preserve the Orphan Drug Tax Credit. Passed in 1983 as a component of the Orphan Drug Act, This allows a credit against tax up to 50% of certain clinical testing expenses related to the use of a drug for a rare disease or condition after it's designated as an orphan drug. And of course, it is a critical incentive for companies to create drugs for small populations where research and development would otherwise be too costly. As Congress considers tax reform, it should understand the human benefits associated with the good tax policy like the orphan drug tax credit. We must continue to create an appetite for industry to enter this rare disease market. For Alpha-1, we have established the Therapeutic Access Program, TAP we call it, and we're investing in drug development and venture philanthropy. So our community has taken responsibility for helping drug development, and we hope that as you consider tax reform, that you will think about the importance of the orphan drug tax credit. Thank you very much, John.